Week 4, Lesson 5, Comics as World War II Propaganda. As mentioned before, there are many comic book writers that wanted to bring America's attention over to Europe and the aggressive acts of Hitler. But the American people were still wary about getting involved in World War II after their disappointment with their previous campaigns in Europe. Many didn't even bother being subtle about it. Remember Daredevil from our last class? The guy who fought the giant vampire-looking monster? Well, now he's fighting Hitler. Before America was fighting Hitler. This is from July 1941, before America entered the war. The majority of the stories collected in this issue are by Charles Bureau, who, as best I can tell, was born in America and was not Jewish. So even the Christian Americans wanted Hitler gone. Hitler is shown here as a villain. However, he's never portrayed as absolutely evil here, and he's always shown as a bad guy. He is shown working with dark magic to get information, he's shown teaming up with the Claw, and he's shown ignoring advice from his own top advisors. The comic even tells its readers the problems with dictatorships, and proposes exiling Hitler as a solution to the war in Europe. It's also so over the top that it'd be hard for anyone to take it seriously. Hitler teams up with the Claw, who destroys some dams in Asia to make problems over there. When Hitler is defeated, he begs for his life to the Claw, who grabs him and swims all the way to Germany, holding Hitler in one hand. What makes Daredevil #1 stand out as a solid piece of propaganda is that it's not that mean-spirited. It has fun with the idea of a costumed hero going after Hitler, but it never says that all Nazis are evil and must be stopped at all costs. There's even a part early on when Hitler's advisors are telling Hitler to hold back and wait for the brave Italian troops to join in their latest campaign. But the absolute peak of fear-mongering in comics happened to be completely coincidental. In November 1941, National Comics issue number 18, drawn by none other than Will Eisner, was a story about Uncle Sam, America's mascot, fighting off the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. In this version, it was the Germans that attacked Pearl Harbor, but thanks to America's superior military might and courage, they trapped the German fleet in a ring of fire. Will Eisner predicted the attack on Pearl Harbor, but guessed the wrong member of the Axis who'd attack. It turned out that about a month after the story was published, America was declaring war against the Japanese, and the Germans declared war against the Americans. Pearl Harbor and Hitler's declaration on America were all it took for many of the comics at the time to stop holding back and become unashamed propaganda. In March 1942, Superman issue number 15 was ready to show how Superman would deal with the invading army in Europe. The Oxnalian army, who were clearly supposed to be the Germans, have their entire invasion forces single-handedly destroyed by Superman. Even their leader, Ra's-Ghul, is a dark-haired sociopath with a toothbrush mustache. Within one issue, Superman saves the day, but Ra's-Ghul gets away. This showed the dilemma for Superman and other superpowered heroes. Remember when Superman was first introduced and was fighting traffic violations, bad equipment, and other real-world problems? Well, it turns out that the Second World War was the biggest problem facing the world at the time. It's exactly the type of situation that Superman was designed to fix. We even saw the story in an earlier video where Superman single-handedly stops the war. So, there was a bit of a conflict. On one hand, Superman's supposed to be a role model that does what's best for everyone, and what's best for them at this point in time is stopping the war. On the other hand, Superman is so powerful that there's nothing that Germany could do to stop him from destroying their entire military force by himself. DC did not want to downplay the heroics that the American soldiers were doing overseas, so there was a compromise that had to be made. And I felt that compromise worked pretty well. Clark Kent wanted to join the army, but remember, Clark Kent has glasses, so his eyesight's in question. When it came time to read an eye chart, Superman's X-ray vision happened, and he was so excited to join the army that he didn't realize he was reading a different eye chart on the next wall. This adventure happened in the newspaper comics that Superman starred in at the time. They were the same continuity as the monthly issues, and this is the official reason that Superman didn't go to Europe to fight. This lets Superman fight from the home front and not have to deal with the war. While many covers had Superman doing propaganda poses, it was rare that he was actually involved in the war in any significant way in the issues behind those covers. It wasn't just Superman that got involved in the war effort, though. Superman was just one of hundreds of characters that got behind supporting the war effort. Even characters like Bugs Bunny were encouraging readers to buy war bonds. Even characters designed only to appeal to children, like Super Rabbit, were deciding to help out the war effort. To put that in perspective, that's like Scooby-Doo going to help the Afghan war. Once war was declared in America, you couldn't escape from it, not even in escapist fiction. But if it wasn't enough just to have your heroes in kids' comics fighting war, some publishers created books just to build off the popularity of the war effort. The United States Marines was the title of a comic book made by Magazine Enterprises. It was honestly an interesting comic that tells of actual US battles with some fictionalized account. It has ads for blood donations. It will show actual photographs of soldiers liberating or occupying the islands, and unfortunately, has some of the most racist cartoons I've ever come across while researching the comic. The Slap Happy Japs is a 2-page comic that promotes Japanese stereotypes. It tells about how they have short legs, disguise themselves as businessmen, can't ride normal bicycles, and so on. It's a shame this attitude existed, and it's also a shame that this 2-page insertion existed in this comic, as the rest of the comic has some educational value and is clearly targeting older readers more than it's targeting kids. I'd estimate that the target demographic for this comic are teenage males or men in their early to mid-20s. The United States Marines was only published during World War II and the Korean War. It knew its demographic and wanted to profit off the feelings of the times. Magazine Enterprises also published a magazine called The American Air Forces, which ended before victory in Japan was declared. These comics were created solely to profit off the people's interest in the war. There were also comics where the characters were affected by the war, but the war wasn't the main focus of the comic. In All-Star Comics, many of the members of the Justice Society of America are called off for duty, giving the characters reasons to split up and go on their own adventures. As they do this, Wonder Woman is tasked with taking care of the group's activities and watching their clubhouse when they're gone. One thing I found interesting is that in the build-up to America's war, there were plenty of patriotic heroes and groups in comics that supported trying to stop Hitler. But once the war came to America, the comics stopped creating these types of groups. Boy Commandos at DC and Young Allies at Timely Comics were both created months before Pearl Harbor, but once Pearl Harbor happened, very few similar teams showed up. The ones that were there stayed around, but now that America was involved in the war, it seemed teams encouraging the country's involvement were no longer needed. At Army Post exchanges in Europe, comics were selling 10 times better than traditional magazines. These were huge numbers for a consumer base that had no children in it. Comics were continuing on their way to being recognized as a legitimate medium that you could read in public. But as war started, many of the comic book artists found themselves being drafted. Thankfully, for many of the big names at least, the Army gave them safe, comfortable jobs. Will Eisner, the guy who drew the spirit and predicted the attack on Pearl Harbor, was drafted, but his superiors quickly recognized his work in comics and made him director of the service magazine Army Motors. Army Motors promoted preventative maintenance, and they used these stale bathroom figure drawings to explain how things worked, like guns. Will Eisner used techniques that he learned in comics. He convinced some of his superiors to let him use comics to explain how the services worked. The generals didn't like the idea of comics being used this way. It wasn't a tested method. One of the generals wanted to prove Eisner's way didn't work, so he created an efficiency test at the University of Chicago, and Eisner's comics got better results than the traditional diagrams. Stan Lee, at this point being best known for writing and editing Captain America, was drafted, but got a comfortable position in a training film division. He wrote posters and pamphlets warning soldiers about the dangers of venereal disease. And the guys who created Captain America? Joe Simon was in the Combat Art Corps located in Washington, D.C., where he was tasked with making posters and later propaganda comics for recruitment. Jack Kirby was shipped out to France, where he participated in the D-Day landings. Later, in France, his superiors heard that he was an artist and made him a scout so that he could draw what he saw. Much to his own disbelief, Jack Kirby survived the war and made it back to America in one piece. However, the industry he made his career at was forever altered. Questions to contemplate. Why do you think comics were such a big hit with the soldiers? Do you think comics should have been used to promote pro-war propaganda, or should the writers have taken a more balanced approach?